October 17, 2023, Marion County Courthouse, Oregon. The wooden bench beneath Sarah Hartley's hands was slick with sweat, though the courtroom air was cool. 32 years of waiting had come to this. Her daughter's face, frozen forever at 19 in a photograph she carried in her purse, stared back at her from the enlarged poster resting against the prosecutor's table. Melissa Hartley. Gone since November 1991. Sarah's thumb worried the worn edges of the photo as the judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Conversations died instantly, leaving only the creak of shifting shoes and muffled sobs echoing against the high ceilings. All rise for the verdict. It should have been relief. After decades of dead ends, false suspects, and fading hope, they'd finally gotten here. The DNA, the arrest, the trial, all the promises of justice delivered after 32 years. But something in the prosecutor's expression chilled her. Detective Mark Ellison, the man who had spent half his career chasing Melissa's killer, leaned forward in his seat. His knuckles whitened on the polished rail. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. He knew something. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears as the clerk unfolded the verdict slip, her voice unsteady despite years of routine. In the matter of the state versus Daniel Briggs. Daniel Briggs. The man Sarah had hated for decades. Melissa's ex-boyfriend. The man she'd always believed killed her daughter. On the charge of first-degree murder. The pause stretched until it was unbearable. The jury finds the defendant not guilty. Gasps tore through the courtroom like gunfire. Sarah staggered forward, gripping the wooden bench. She couldn't breathe. Not guilty? Beside her, Melissa's younger brother, Jason, just 7 years old when his sister vanished, slammed his fist against the pew. What the hell? The judge rapped his gavel, calling for order, but the voices swelled louder, rippling through the gallery. And then the real blow landed. From the prosecutor's table, Assistant District Attorney Claire Monroe stood, clearing her throat. Her voice was tight, controlled, but the words detonated like grenades. Based on newly presented forensic evidence. The state now believes Melissa Hartley's killer is still at large. Murmurs erupted. A reporter in the back audibly gasped. Sarah felt her knees buckle. For 32 years she'd hated the wrong man. 32 years believing Daniel Briggs had murdered her baby. But now, here, in this suffocating courtroom, everything she thought she knew was ripped away. She turned slowly toward the defense table. Briggs sat there stiffly, his jaw clenched, not celebrating. Not relieved. Just hollow-eyed, as if 32 years of being the town's villain had left him empty. Across the room, Detective Ellison shoved past reporters and disappeared through a side door. Sarah caught a glimpse of his face before he vanished, grim, pale, furious. He wasn't giving up. The journalists erupted, shouting questions over one another. Detective Ellison. Is there another suspect? Do you have a name? Was the DNA wrong all along? Ellison didn't answer. He pushed through the hallway, shoulders tight, his phone buzzing in his pocket. The call he'd been waiting for. November 2, 1991. Rain hammered against the roof of a rusted Ford Bronco parked on the edge of a wooded creek just outside Salem, Oregon. Inside, Melissa Hartley sat behind the wheel, headlights off, hands trembling on the steering wheel. Her breath fogged the glass as she glanced at the clock, 11:53 p.m. She shouldn't have been here. She told her mom she was heading straight home after the bar, but something had pulled her off the main road. Something, or someone. A pair of headlights flared in her rearview mirror, blinding her. Melissa's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She reached for the ignition. When a shadow moved past her window. In the courthouse hallway, Detective Ellison stood with his back to the wall, phone pressed tight to his ear. The voice on the other end was sharp, breathless. Detective, we've got a match. The DNA's clean. It's not Briggs. Ellison's jaw tightened. Then who is it? A pause. Someone who was never even on our radar. He swallowed hard, his gaze shifting back toward the courtroom doors where chaos still brewed. Send me everything you've got. Back inside, Sarah collapsed into Jason's arms, sobs racking her chest. Around her, cameras clicked, reporters whispered, and somewhere beyond the walls of the courthouse, Oregon's oldest cold case had just exploded wide open. 32 years of certainty were gone. The killer was still out there. And he had been, all along. If you asked anyone in Salem back in 1991 to describe Melissa Hartley, the answer came fast. She lit up the room. Melissa was just 19, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind that made people believe she was meant for something more than the small-town rhythm of diner shifts, borrowed cars, and Friday nights at the local bowling alley. She had a laugh that came in bursts, loud, unexpected, infectious. Friends said you couldn't stay mad around her, not for long. If she caught you sulking, she'd scrunch her nose, toss her wavy chestnut hair, and do some ridiculous impression until you cracked a smile. But behind the brightness was something steadier, dreams. Her dreams and quirks. Melissa loved the outdoors. Not in the rugged, camping 4 weeks way, but in the let me take a picture of that sunset because no two skies are ever the same way. She carried a cheap second-hand camera everywhere, clicking away at everything, her cat curled on the windowsill, her little brother Jason's muddy sneakers after soccer practice, the stretch of wildflowers along Highway 22. On the back of her bedroom door, she taped dozens of her photographs, overlapping until the wood was barely visible. Her mother, Sarah, once joked that she'd pasted a whole new world inside her room. Melissa wanted to study wildlife photography. She'd circled brochures from community colleges, left library books scattered across her bed, and scribbled in her journal about someday traveling to Yellowstone or Alaska. But those were dreams for later. For now, she was living paycheck to paycheck, working shifts at the Silver Spoon Diner off Liberty Street, saving what she could in a mason jar tucked under her bed. Her place in the community. In a small Oregon town in 1991, everybody knew everybody, and Melissa was the kind of girl people noticed. At the diner, she called regulars by name, memorized their orders, and slipped extra creamers into old Mr. Dawson's coffee because she knew he liked it that way. Teenagers stopped by just to chat with her during her breaks. Her boss once said, Melissa could turn a customer's whole day around with just one smile. At church on Sundays, she sang in the choir, not perfectly, but with heart. At family cookouts, she was the one organizing games for the kids, making sure no one was left out. It wasn't just her charm, it was her kindness. That kindness rippled through the town, which is why her loss wouldn't just be a family's tragedy, it would wound an entire community. Her relationships. Melissa's relationship with her family was close, sometimes messy, but full of love. Her mother, Sarah, was protective, maybe overly so. After all, Sarah had raised 2 kids largely on her own after her husband left when Melissa was in middle school. Sarah worried about everything, her daughter walking home late from work, riding with boys who drove too fast, or going out to parties where she couldn't keep watch. Melissa would roll her eyes but always hug her mom before leaving, whispering, "Don't worry, I'll be fine." Her little brother Jason adored her. At 7, he followed her everywhere, tugging on her sleeve, begging her to play tag or read him stories. He still remembers how she used to tape his drawings to her wall, right beside her photographs, as if his stick figures were just as important as her art. Then there was her circle of friends. She was the glue, the one who planned sleepovers, who always offered a ride in her rattling old Ford Bronco, who slipped notes in lockers with doodles and encouragement before big tests. And yes, there was Daniel Briggs, the boy everyone thought she'd end up with. He was a year older, moody, and prone to jealousy, but Melissa, ever the optimist, believed she could fix him. Their relationship burned hot and fast, ending in tears and slammed doors just months before her death. Friends later admitted she'd seemed lighter once she left him. The warning signs. Looking back, some remember moments that seemed small at the time, but chilling in hindsight. A co-worker recalls Melissa saying someone had been calling the diner, hanging up when she answered. Her best friend said Melissa had mentioned once, just once, feeling like a car was following her home. And in her journal, a final entry written weeks before she died. Sometimes I feel like someone's watching. I tell myself it's nothing, but I still check the locks twice. At the time, no one thought much of it. In small towns, girls were harassed, followed, whispered about, and most of the time, it amounted to nothing. But later, these details would take on new weight. Why her loss devastated the community. When Melissa disappeared in November 1991, the entire town changed. For weeks, search parties combed the woods. Flyers with her smiling face papered every store window and telephone pole. The diner shut down for a day so co-workers could join the search. Her friends stopped laughing the same way. The choir missed her voice. The Silver Spoon's regulars found their coffee colder without her warmth behind the counter. For her family, the loss was immeasurable. Sarah said it best years later. It wasn't just that Melissa died. It was that the world lost everything she would have been. Every photograph she never got to take. Every trip she never got to go on. Every birthday she should have celebrated. We lost a lifetime, not just a daughter. That's why the courtroom shock in 2023 cut so deeply. For decades, people had believed the story was simple. Melissa's jealous ex-boyfriend snapped, and justice was only a matter of time. Her death became a cautionary tale, folded neatly into small-town law. But when the verdict shattered that certainty, it wasn't just about one man walking free. It was about 32 years of grief, anger, and whispered blame suddenly unraveling. Because if Daniel Briggs wasn't guilty, then the real killer had been out there all along. And Melissa's story, the one the town thought they knew, had only just begun. November 1st, 1991, Salem, Oregon. The day started like any other. The leaves had turned copper and gold, carpeting the sidewalks of Liberty Street. A cold mist hung in the air, the kind that clung to skin and crept into your lungs. At 8:05 a.m., Melissa Hartley pushed open the glass door of the Silver Spoon Diner and stepped inside, shaking droplets from her jacket. "Morning, Mel," her co-worker Dana called from behind the counter, balancing a tray of coffee mugs. Melissa smiled, rubbing her hands together to fight the chill. "Feels like winter already." She clocked in, tied her apron, and began her shift like it was any other Friday. No one at the diner, not Dana, not the regulars at the counter, not Melissa herself, had any idea it would be the last day they'd ever see her alive. 8:30 a.m., the diner. Business was slow. Melissa poured coffee for the early truckers, joked with the high school kids skipping first period, and slid extra creamers to Mr. Dawson, the retired postman who never tipped but always made her laugh. Dana later remembered something odd. Around 9:15, Melissa answered a call at the diner's front desk. Dana swore she heard Melissa's cheerful tone falter, replaced by clipped, cautious words. "No, I can't. I told you, I'm done. Please stop calling me here." When Dana asked later who it was, Melissa brushed it off with a shrug. "Wrong number," she said. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. 12:30 p.m., lunch with a friend. Melissa's best friend, Rachel Lee, met her at Moose's sandwich shop downtown. They sat in a booth by the window, sipping Diet Cokes and splitting curly fries. Rachel remembered Melissa being quieter than usual. She kept checking the window, Rachel told detectives later. Not obvious, but like she was making sure no one was outside. When Rachel pressed, Melissa just shook her head. "It's nothing. Just tired." But Rachel knew her better than that. 3:15 p.m., the photograph. After lunch, Melissa drove to Willamette Park, a small strip of woods along the river, her second-hand Canon camera riding shotgun. She spent nearly an hour taking photos of birds along the waterline, crouched low in damp grass, oblivious to the cold wind sweeping off the river. The roll of film recovered from her Bronco later showed something strange. The last 3 frames weren't of birds. They weren't even focused. One blurred shot captured a dark sedan parked crookedly along the roadside. Another was just treetops. And the final frame was completely black. Whether it was an accident, a warning, or something else entirely, no one knew. 5:45 p.m., at home. By late afternoon, Melissa was back home in the small blue house she shared with her mom and little brother Jason. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter. Jason, then 7, sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, watching Rescue 9/11. He remembers Melissa walking past, ruffling his hair, and asking if he'd locked the back door. He told her yes, but she checked it herself anyway. 7 p.m., the bar. That night, Melissa made last-minute plans to meet co-workers at Rusty's Tavern, a dim little bar off Highway 214 known for sticky floors, bad jukeboxes, and cheap beer. Rusty's was packed, it was payday Friday, and nearly every 20-something in town was there. Multiple witnesses later placed Melissa sitting in a corner booth, sipping a rum and coke and laughing with Dana and a few regulars. At some point, Daniel Briggs, her ex-boyfriend, walked in. According to statements, Daniel approached the table but Melissa waved him off. One witness overheard her saying, "Not tonight, Danny. Please." Daniel didn't push it. He stayed at the bar for one drink, then left. Detectives would spend months combing over this timeline, arguing about Daniel's movements that night. For decades, this moment would fuel the theory of a jealous ex snapping after rejection. But it wasn't the whole story. 10:42 p.m., the last call. At 10:42 p.m., Melissa called home from the payphone outside Rusty's. Her mom answered, relieved to hear her voice. "Don't stay out too late," Sarah told her. "I won't," Melissa promised. "I'll be home by midnight." It was the last time Sarah ever heard her daughter's voice. 11 p.m., leaving Rusty's. Melissa left Rusty's around 11 p.m. Security camera footage from a nearby gas station, grainy and time-stamped incorrectly, later captured her Bronco heading south on Highway 214. Behind her, 2 sets of headlights appeared. One belonged to Dana, heading home. The other belonged to a vehicle detectives wouldn't identify for 32 years. 11:20 p.m., witness at the overpass. Just past 11:20 p.m., a truck driver named Earl Whitman spotted Melissa's Bronco parked along the shoulder of a wooded service road. "I slowed down 'cause it looked like car trouble," Earl later told police. "But there was another car pulled up behind her, lights off. Couldn't see the make. Figured someone was helping her out, so I kept going." That was the last confirmed sighting of Melissa alive. The unanswered gaps. From 11:30 p.m. onward, Melissa's final movements are a mystery. Her Bronco was later found abandoned near a creek 2 miles off Highway 214. Her purse and camera were inside, untouched. The driver's door was open. And there were no signs of a struggle, not at first glance. But what investigators didn't release publicly at the time was more unsettling. Beneath Melissa's fingernails, they found DNA. Unknown. Preserved. Waiting 3 decades for technology to catch up. The dread before the storm. The next morning, Sarah woke to an empty bedroom and an unmade bed. By noon, she was calling friends, co-workers, anyone who might have seen her daughter. By Saturday evening, panic had settled over Salem. Volunteers canvassed fields. Flyers plastered grocery store windows. Local news anchors interrupted football broadcasts with pleas for information. And on Sunday morning, November 3rd, at 7:12 a.m., a fisherman spotted something tangled in driftwood along the creek. It was Melissa. Back in the courtroom, 3 decades later, those last hours would take on new meaning. That unanswered phone call at the diner. The dark sedan in the blurred photograph. The headlights on the highway that night. For 32 years, everyone thought the pieces fit one way. But the DNA from beneath Melissa's fingernails told a different story. Daniel Briggs wasn't even there. Which meant someone else had been, someone who had escaped suspicion for over 3 decades. It was early morning on August 17, 1991. The sun hadn't fully risen over the sleepy North Carolina town of Fairview. A heavy fog clung to the roadside fields, curling between the trees like restless ghosts. The highway was quiet except for the occasional rumble of an 18-wheeler in the distance. A pair of construction workers, headed to a job site near the old highway bypass, noticed something unusual just off the gravel turnout, a single-tire track leading into a wooded clearing. At first, it looked unremarkable, but one of the men, Earl Whitaker, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "That ain't normal," Earl muttered, slowing his truck. "Nobody parks out here this time of morning." He pulled over. What started as curiosity quickly turned into dread. The discovery. Earl stepped out into the damp morning air, his boots sinking slightly into the dew-soaked earth. As he followed the faint tire track, a strange silence settled around him. The usual chatter of cicadas and birds was absent. And then he saw it. At the base of a large oak tree, half hidden by brush, lay a woman's body. Her blonde hair was matted, tangled with dirt and leaves. Her blouse was torn, one sleeve hanging loose. There was a faint streak of dried blood on her cheek, and her hands were bound in front of her with frayed nylon rope. Earl froze. Oh, God, no. His co-worker, Billy Hines, came up behind him and immediately staggered backward, gagging. They didn't need to check for a pulse. Whoever she was long gone. The 911 call. At 6:42 a.m., Earl's shaky voice came over the Fairview County dispatcher line. "This is Earl Whitaker. I'm out by the old bypass near mile marker 17. There's a woman out here. She's dead." Within 15 minutes, the small gravel turnout was transformed into a controlled crime scene. Arrival of law enforcement. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape, forcing back early morning rubberneckers who'd heard chatter on the police scanner. By 7:15 a.m., Detective Alejandro Ramirez arrived, a sharp-eyed investigator in his early 40s, known for his meticulous attention to detail. The scene immediately told him 2 things. The body had been dumped, not killed here. There was no significant blood pooling at the site. Tire impressions suggested the killer's vehicle had backed into the clearing. The disposal was rushed and careless. The victim's hands were bound, but not tightly. Her shoes were missing. A torn fragment of floral pattern fabric, possibly from her dress, was caught on a nearby branch. Ramirez crouched near the body, gloved hands steady, scanning for anything out of place. Forensic details, grounded, not overwhelming. Time of death, estimated between midnight and 3 a.m. Cause of death, pending autopsy, but ligature marks around the neck suggested strangulation. Trace evidence. Fibers from a cheap nylon rope on her wrists. Tiny red paint flakes on the back of her blouse. Tire impressions matching a light-duty pickup or SUV. Missing personal items. No purse. No jewelry. No shoes. The emotional weight. By late morning, word had spread like wildfire. Locals gathered on the shoulder of the road, whispering among themselves. Some prayed. Others speculated. Then came the moment everyone feared. The victim was identified as Crystal Turner, a 25-year-old waitress from the nearby town of Ashbrook. Her parents, Linda and Robert Turner, were notified around 10:15 a.m. Linda collapsed in the doorway when deputies arrived. Robert, pale and shaking, kept asking the same question. Are you sure it's her? Are you absolutely sure? Ramirez's internal shift. For Detective Ramirez, this wasn't just another case. Crystal's younger brother, Tommy, had been one of his son's best friends in high school. That made this personal. As he stood near the tree line, staring at the crumpled body bag being loaded into the coroner's van, something in him hardened. This wasn't random, he muttered to Agent Emily Carter, an FBI liaison recently assigned to assist on violent crimes. Whoever did this wanted her gone, but they wanted us to find her. Emily's sharp blue eyes narrowed. You think it's a message? Feels like one, Ramirez replied. A small but crucial clue. Just as the crime scene team wrapped up, a rookie deputy flagged Ramirez down. Detective, you'll want to see this. Behind a fallen log, about 10 feet from where Crystal's body was found, they discovered a single Polaroid photo, its edges damp with morning dew. It showed a blurred image of Crystal, clearly alive, sitting in what looked like the passenger seat of a vehicle. Her expression was tense, lips slightly parted as though mid-protest. Scrawled on the back of the photo in smudged black ink were 3 chilling words. She deserved this. The first ripple. By sunset, the scene was cleared. The locals went home unsettled. Investigators returned to their offices with more questions than answers. But in one corner of town, inside a small, dimly lit house, someone watched the evening news and smiled faintly as the reporter described the discovery. The killer wasn't finished. The August sun bore down on Boone, North Carolina, but inside the narrow canyon where Crystal Turner's blue Kia Soul had been discovered, the air felt different, heavier, charged with an uneasy silence. By mid-morning, the parking lot near the La Salle Mountains had become a staging ground for chaos. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered weakly in the breeze, stretched between crooked branches and jagged rocks. Sheriff's deputies moved with careful precision, their boots crunching over the rocky terrain. The usual tranquil hum of insects and rustling leaves had been replaced by the muffled murmur of radios, clipped commands, and the low whir of evidence cameras. Detective Alejandro Ramirez crouched beside the car, his gloved hand hovering inches above the driver's side door handle. He didn't touch it. Not yet. The vehicle sat awkwardly askew, half hidden behind a thicket of aspen trees. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no slashed tires. But Ramirez had done this long enough to know, what wasn't there often mattered more than what was. Tag every footprint, he said to a deputy standing nearby. And I want a drone sweep over the ridge. If someone dumped this car here, they didn't drag it in broad daylight. Inside the Kia, an eerie stillness reigned. On the passenger seat, a pair of hiking boots sat neatly side by side, laces still tied. A coffee cup rested in the cup holder, long gone cold, the faded logo from a Boone cafe barely visible under a layer of dust. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, and yet, something about the scene screamed wrong. Forensics arrives. By noon, the small clearing had transformed into a makeshift laboratory. Agent Emily Carter from the FBI had arrived, her crisp tactical vest contrasting with the sweat-soaked deputies. Ramirez had worked with her before, and though they didn't always agree, he respected her instincts. What do we have? Carter asked, sliding on latex gloves. Not much, Ramirez replied, handing her a tablet displaying drone images of the area. The car's clean. No obvious prints except theirs, at least so far. No drag marks, no discarded clothes, no tire tracks beyond these. He pointed at faint impressions leading back to the highway. If someone staged this, they knew what they were doing. Carter crouched, peering under the chassis. Or, she said, glancing up at him, they're still out there, watching. The thought hung in the air like a storm cloud. Interviews begin. Deputies began canvassing the area, talking to campers, hikers, and park rangers. Boone was a small town, and disappearances like this weren't supposed to happen here, not to people like Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner, 2 women who'd built their lives around the outdoors, community, and trust. One ranger, a wiry man in his 60s named Frankie Malone, leaned against his ATV as Ramirez approached. "Frankie," Ramirez said, flipping open his notebook. "Tell me about this spot. Anyone usually camp up here?" Malone scratched his gray stubble. "Couple folks now and then. Mostly locals, some climbers. But lately? It's been different." "Different how?" "Past few weeks, we've had complaints. Folks saying there's been this guy hanging around. Comes into camps, makes small talk, but there's something off about him. People been spooked." Ramirez's pen paused mid-sentence. "Anyone report it?" "Couple did. Nothing we could act on. No name, no plates. Just a bad feeling." That phrase came up again and again as interviews continued. A bad feeling. Someone had been lurking, watching. And yet, no one could describe him clearly. No surveillance cameras. No witnesses. Just whispers. The missing timeline. Back at the command tent, pinned beneath the weight of maps and photographs, Ramirez studied the couple's last known movements. August 12th, Keelan and Crystal were last seen leaving Woody's Tavern, laughing and arm in arm. August 13th, a friend received a text from Keelan mentioning a creepy guy near their campsite. August 14th, silence. No calls, no social media activity. August 15th, the Kia is discovered. The text message gnawed at him. Creepy guy. Agent Carter stood behind him, arms folded, scanning the same notes. "If we find this guy," she said, "we find our suspect." Or, Ramirez muttered, "our killer." A break, and a dead end. By late afternoon, forensics came back with their first results. No foreign prints, the tech reported. Just Keelan's and Crystal's on the steering wheel, the cup holder, the door handles. Nothing else. "It's like no one else touched this car." Ramirez rubbed the bridge of his nose. "That doesn't make sense. Someone left it here. And wiped it," Carter countered. "Whoever did this planned it." But that didn't fit either. If this was premeditated, why leave the car at all? Why not burn it? Sink it? A deputy approached, holding a clear evidence bag. Inside was a folded piece of paper, edges worn soft. "Found this stuffed in the driver's side visor," he said. Ramirez slipped on fresh gloves and carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a note. It was a hand-drawn map of the campsite and surrounding trails. 2 spots were marked with crude excess. He stared at it, a chill creeping up his spine. Pressure mounts. By nightfall, the clearing had emptied, but the investigation had only grown darker. The media had caught wind of the case. Satellite trucks lined Boone's Main Street. Reporters shoved microphones in the faces of friends and relatives, their voices blending grief with outrage. Keelan's father, Sean Paul Schultz, stood outside the sheriff's office, trembling with barely contained anger. "My daughter sent a text," he told the cameras. "She said there was a man creeping around their campsite. And now she's missing. How does that happen in Boone? How does nobody know anything?" Ramirez watched the footage later that night in the incident command center, the words settling like stones in his gut. How indeed. That night, as Ramirez drove back toward town, headlights slicing through the dense mountain fog, his radio crackled. "Unit 12, a deputy's voice came through, tight with strain. "You're gonna want to see this." "Go ahead," Ramirez said, slowing his cruiser. We found something. Up near the second ridge." He gripped the wheel. "Bodies?" There was a long pause, then, "Yes, sir." Ramirez didn't answer. He didn't have to. The game had just changed. The weeks after Melissa Hartley's body was found blurred into months. And those months bled into years. What began as an all-hands-on-deck investigation in the spring of 1991 gradually slowed to a crawl. Tips dried up, leads evaporated, and frustration set in. Melissa's name was whispered less and less in the hallways of the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office, but for her family, time stopped on the night she was killed. An investigation stuck in neutral. Detective Frank Dwyer, then a 32-year-old investigator with the Sheriff's Office, still remembers those first 6 months vividly. "We had everything pinned on catching a break," Dwyer recalled in a 2018 interview. "Somebody saw something, somebody knew something, but the call never came." The department ran through every traditional lead they had, interviewing friends, classmates, and co-workers at the diner where Melissa worked. Knocking on doors in 3 surrounding counties, searching for anyone who'd seen her after she left work the night she disappeared. Following up on anonymous tips that trickled in through the sheriff's tip line. At one point, investigators thought they were close when a red Ford pickup was spotted near the back roads Melissa was believed to have walked that night. But after tracking the vehicle down, the owner produced a rock-solid alibi. He'd been fishing with friends 40 miles away. "We'd go 2 steps forward, 5 steps back," Dwyer admitted. It felt like chasing smoke. The toll on the Hartley family. While law enforcement was drowning in frustration, Melissa's parents, John and Carol Hartley, were living in a nightmare that refused to end. In the first year after her death, Carol refused to touch Melissa's bedroom. The pastel blue walls remained covered in posters of 80s rock bands, a half-filled diary sat open on the desk, and her uniform from the diner hung neatly in the closet. "I'd sit on her bed every night," Carol shared in a 2005 local interview. "I talked to her. I thought if I kept her room just the way it was, somehow she'd walk back through that door." John, meanwhile, coped in his own way, by throwing himself into advocacy. He plastered missing person-style flyers around town, not to find Melissa, but to find her killer. He called every TV station, every newspaper, every year on the anniversary of her death. But as the years rolled by, calls went unreturned, and news outlets lost interest. Shifting priorities. By 1994, a new sheriff was elected, and the Hartley case was no longer top priority. Cold cases stacked up, and resources were funneled elsewhere. The small town of Forest Grove had seen a string of burglaries, a suspected drug ring, and later a series of arsons that consumed the department's attention. For Melissa's case, active investigation meant one thing: filing away another dead-end tip. Dwyer, still haunted by the case, admitted later, "It's the kind of thing that keeps you up at night. We failed them, and I felt it every single day." The community's slow silence. In the early years, Forest Grove rallied around the Hartleys. Prayer vigils, candlelight marches, and fundraising drives were organized by local churches and schools. But by the late 90s, those events dwindled. Rumors, however, did not. There were whispers about an abusive ex-boyfriend. About a drifter seen in town the week she disappeared. About a former diner co-worker who suddenly left the state. But none of these theories stuck. Every time someone thought they had the answer, it fell apart, said local reporter Anita Moore, who covered the case for the Rutherford Gazette. After a while, people just stopped talking about it. And that silence was the hardest thing for the Hartleys to bear. Fractures within the family. By the early 2000s, the Hartleys' marriage began to fray under the weight of unanswered questions. Carol grew bitter, resentful even, convinced law enforcement had botched the investigation from the start. John, meanwhile, became obsessed, spending hours combing through old newspaper clippings, FOIA requests, and even driving to nearby counties to chase ghosts, as Carol once put it. Their son, Danny, only 12 at the time of Melissa's death, withdrew completely. By his late teens, he dropped out of school and eventually left town altogether. Losing Melissa didn't just take her, Carol said quietly in a 2012 interview. It took all of us. The weight on investigators. Detective Dwyer left the sheriff's office in 1998. He cited burnout, but colleagues whispered that the Hartley case haunted him more than he let on. Others who worked the case echoed similar frustrations. Leads that looked promising but fizzled out. Witnesses who moved away or refused to talk. Evidence degraded by time and storage limitations. By 2005, the case file had grown to over 3,000 pages, yet not a single suspect had ever been charged. Technology brings hope. Then disappointment. In 2010, the Hartley case briefly returned to headlines when advances in DNA testing gave investigators a glimmer of hope. A small biological sample recovered from Melissa's clothing was sent to a private lab. For weeks, the Hartleys held their breath. Then the results came back, no matching CODIS. It was another devastating blow. "That call nearly broke me," Carol admitted. "I'd started planning how we'd finally put this to rest. And then, nothing." The passage of time. By the late 2010s, Melissa's case sat buried in a filing cabinet marked cold. The once bustling investigation had been reduced to a box of fading photographs, brittle statements, and physical evidence sealed away in storage. The Hartleys, now in their 60s, were tired, but not ready to give up. Every year, on the anniversary of Melissa's death, Carol mailed letters to the sheriff's office, begging them not to forget her daughter's name. Most went unanswered. And yet, time wasn't done with this case. Unbeknownst to the Hartleys, the answer had been sitting in that evidence locker for nearly 3 decades. It would take cutting-edge DNA genealogy, an unexpected turn of fate, and the relentless persistence of a young cold case investigator to finally shake loose the truth. But in 2018, 27 years after Melissa's murder, all the Hartleys knew was grief, silence, and a small-town justice system that had failed them. For a small town like Fairhope, the absence of answers didn't leave silence, it left room for stories. Over the decades following Melissa Hartley's disappearance in June 1991, the narrative of her final night morphed into something far stranger, something shaped as much by imagination as by fact. Each retelling twisted slightly, sharpening the edges of tragedy until Melissa wasn't just a victim anymore, she became a myth. A ghost on Fairhope Road. There's a bend on Fairhope Road where the oak trees lean in, their twisted limbs tangling above like skeletal fingers. Locals call it Melissa's Curve. Even today, if you drive past just after midnight, you'll find flickering candles and faded flowers tucked under the trees. Teenagers dare each other to park there with their headlights off, waiting for the so-called Hartley hitchhiker, a pale figure in a sundress, seen by more than a dozen locals over the years. They say she stands by the roadside, right where her car was found, recalls Tommy Deacon, now in his late 40s, who was a teenager when Melissa vanished. Hand out, like she's asking for a ride. But if you stop, she disappears. Poof. Just gone. Tommy laughs nervously after telling the story, as though he doesn't quite believe it himself, but he swears he won't drive Fairhope Road after dark. Some say the sightings started in the early 2000s, when Melissa's case had already gone cold. People reported headlights in the rearview mirror, phantoms sobbing from the tree line, and cold spots that made the hairs on their arms stand up. Others whispered that Melissa wasn't resting because her killer was still free. For grieving families like the Hartleys, these ghost stories were agony. Melissa's younger sister, Janine, remembers yelling at kids in the grocery store who joked about summoning Melissa's spirit on Halloween. She wasn't a story to scare your friends, Janine says. She was my sister. She had a life. She had dreams. Rumors that never died. In a town starved for answers, speculation became currency. By the mid-90s, theories about Melissa's death ran wild. The boyfriend theory. Many believed Melissa's ex-boyfriend, Aaron Cole, had snapped in a jealous rage. He'd been questioned early on, his alibi shaky, his temper notorious. But no evidence ever tied him to the crime. People still cross the street when they see him, says one lifelong resident. Doesn't matter that he was cleared. Around here, suspicion sticks. The drifter theory. Others insisted a transient laborer passing through town was responsible. There were whispers about a man in a rust-red pickup truck seen parked near Fairhope Road that night. Some claimed he was later arrested in another state for a similar assault, but police records never backed it up. The ritual theory. This one emerged in the late 90s when a local newspaper ran a story about occult symbols found carved into a tree near the crime scene. The sheriff at the time dismissed it as teenage vandalism, but the idea stuck. Soon, Melissa's death was linked, unfairly and without evidence, to satanic panic hysteria sweeping small-town America. There were whispers of late-night bonfires in the woods, cloaked figures, and sacrifices. By the early 2000s, teenagers were daring each other to sneak out to the so-called Devil's Hollow, a clearing less than a mile from where Melissa's car was discovered. The toll of myth-making. For the Hartley family, each rumor was another wound. We had to listen to strangers talk about Melissa like she was a character in some horror movie, Janine recalls. Every time the news brought up a new theory, we'd get phone calls from reporters, neighbors, even kids from the high school wanting to see the body site. In 1998, someone spray-painted "She Never Left" in red across an abandoned barn near the old logging road where Melissa's shoe was found. For her parents, Martha and George Hartley, it was the final straw. They moved out of Fairhope in 1999, selling the house where Melissa grew up. But leaving town didn't quiet the noise. Even years later, whenever a cold case podcast or paranormal show revisited Melissa's murder, the Hartleys would get calls from strangers asking if they felt her presence. Paranormal exploitation. By the mid-2000s, Melissa's story had left Fairhope and entered a broader true crime and meets paranormal folklore culture. Cable shows like Ghost Trails and America's Haunted Crimes sent crews to Fairhope to film recreations of Melissa's last night. Local businesses profited quietly from the attention. A diner renamed one of its milkshakes the Hartley Haunt, but many residents felt exploited. It turned her into content, says Detective Ramirez, who worked the cold case unit years later. Every myth made it harder to focus on the facts. Witnesses stopped trusting us. Tips got clouded by ghost stories. One paranormal investigator even claimed to have recorded Melissa's voice using EVP, electronic voice phenomenon. The clip, played endlessly on late-night radio, was barely decipherable static, but conspiracy theorists swore it said, "I know who did it." For a while, Fairhope became a kind of dark tourism site. People would leave notes on trees, candles on the roadside, and sometimes, disturbing offerings. In 2011, police found a dead crow nailed to a fence post near where Melissa's purse was discovered decades earlier. When myths replace memory. By the 2010s, an entire generation had grown up in Fairhope knowing Melissa's name before knowing her story. Ask teenagers where Melissa Hartley's car was found, and you get two wildly different answers, neither correct. The deeper tragedy, Janine says, is how Melissa's real life got buried beneath legends. Few remembered she'd been accepted to North Carolina State to study graphic design. Few talked about how she worked double shifts at the diner to pay for tuition. Few knew about the journal she kept, filled with sketches and lists of songs she wanted to learn on guitar. Melissa wasn't some restless spirit, Janine insists. She was a sister, a daughter, a friend. She laughed too loud. She hated olives. She wanted to live in Asheville and have a house full of plants. But to outsiders, Melissa had become a campfire story. The silence beneath the noise. Despite all the rumors, the ghost stories, the urban myths, one thing never changed. The case file stayed thin. There was no arrest, no confession, no resolution. For Detective Ramirez, who reopened the cold case in 2017, cutting through decades of legend to reach the truth was like digging through layers of hardened earth. Every interview started the same, Ramirez says. I heard someone say, or they told me once, nobody had facts anymore. It was all hearsay piled on top of hearsay. Melissa's case became a haunting in the truest sense, not because of spirits, but because the unanswered questions refused to rest. Foreshadowing the breakthrough. Unbeknownst to Fairhope, the truth was still out there, buried not in legends but in science. When investigators submitted Melissa's clothing for advanced DNA testing in 2019, they hoped against hope. The technology didn't exist in 1991. Now, decades later, it could illuminate answers that rumor and myth had obscured. For nearly 30 years, Fairhope clung to ghost stories to explain Melissa's fate. Soon, the real story would finally break through, and it would be darker than any legend ever told. September 17, 2021, 11:42 a.m. Henderson County Sheriff's Office. Hendersonville, North Carolina. Detective Rachel Kincaid stared at the email on her screen, the words blurring for a moment as her mind tried to process them. She had been assigned to cold cases for nearly a decade now, and rarely, if ever, did anything about Melissa Hartley's 1991 disappearance come across her desk that wasn't another dead end. But this was different. Subject: CODIS hit, case reference 91-07-344. From North Carolina State Crime Lab. Message: partial DNA profile recovered from victim's clothing now matches a known offender in the federal database. Please contact us immediately. For 30 years, Melissa Hartley had been little more than a face on a faded flyer tacked up on bulletin boards and church entrances. Her disappearance had haunted the small community of Laurel Ridge, her smile frozen in time, her story whispered in fragments at high school reunions and church picnics. And now, suddenly, there was a name. The call. Detective Kincaid picked up the phone with shaking hands, dialing the number for the crime lab's forensic division. The voice on the other end was brisk, clinical, but beneath it was the unspoken weight of 3 decades. Detective Kincaid? We've rerun the Hartley evidence using next-generation DNA sequencing. Technology wasn't there back in '91, but now we can process much smaller, degraded samples. Rachel's throat tightened. And you've got a match. A partial match, the technician clarified. Not strong enough for an immediate warrant, but strong enough to focus the investigation. The name is Clifford Ray Henson. He's serving time in South Carolina for an unrelated assault. Rachel scribbled the name into her notebook like it might evaporate if she didn't trap it on paper. Clifford Henson. 57 years old. Multiple priors for burglary, assault, and unlawful restraint. At the time of Melissa's disappearance? He'd been working as a handyman in Laurel Ridge. It was like the past had just exhaled a secret it had been holding for 30 years. The family gets the call. 2 hours later, Rachel was parked in front of the Hartley home. The house hadn't changed much since 1991. Same white siding, same wind chimes clinking softly in the late summer air. Melissa's mother, Janet Hartley, opened the door. She looked older, of course, deep lines framed her tired eyes, but her presence was exactly as Rachel remembered, kind, restrained, and perpetually braced for heartbreak. Detective, Janet said softly, stepping aside to let her in. Please, tell me this isn't another one of those rumors. Rachel shook her head. Janet, we have something. It's not everything, but it's more than we've ever had. Janet lowered herself onto the couch, clutching a throw pillow to her chest. Her hands trembled. "We retested Melissa's clothing," Rachel explained gently. "There's a DNA profile we couldn't match back then, but we've got a partial hit now. It's a man named Clifford Ray Henson. He lived in Laurel Ridge at the time. He's in prison now." Janet's breath caught audibly, her knuckles white against the pillow. "Does this mean," she whispered, "you finally know what happened to my baby?" Rachel paused. "Not yet. But Janet, this could be the break we've been waiting for." For the first time in years, Janet allowed herself to cry, not the slow, exhausted tears of a grieving mother, but the sharp, unexpected kind that come with hope. Word spreads. By the next morning, the news had leaked. Laurel Ridge buzzed like it hadn't in decades. Melissa Hartley's name was everywhere, whispered at gas stations, discussed over coffee at Darby's Diner, debated fiercely on Facebook groups dedicated to local cold cases. Some residents clung to anger. "I always said it was someone local. Someone we trusted." Others clung to relief. "Finally, after all these years, maybe we'll have answers." And then there were the urban myths, reignited like a dormant wildfire. Old rumors resurfaced, stories about strange lights near the riverbank, a secret cult rumored to meet in the woods, even whispers that Melissa had run away willingly and was living under another name. But for once, the theories didn't matter. The case file wasn't just collecting dust anymore. Reconstructing Melissa's last night. Detective Kincaid and her team began revisiting every detail of Melissa's final hours on July 14, 1991. 7:30 p.m., Melissa clocked out of her shift at Rayburn's grocery. 8 p.m., witnesses saw her walking toward the parking lot where she usually met her boyfriend, Aaron Lister. 8:15 p.m., a neighbor swore she saw Melissa arguing with a man near the edge of the lot, but back then, the description was too vague to be useful. 8:30 p.m., Melissa's car was found abandoned near the edge of Sable Creek Woods. At the time, Clifford Henson had been working on a maintenance contract just 2 blocks away. Police interviewed him briefly in 1991, but he had an alibi, a drinking buddy who swore they'd been at Murphy's Tavern all night. That buddy, however, was now deceased. With the DNA evidence, the alibi was suddenly flimsy. A race against time. Rachel drove to Allendale Correctional Facility in South Carolina to request an interview with Henson. On the drive down, she rehearsed her questions, her jaw clenched with determination. When she finally sat across from him in the sterile interview room, Henson leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a mocking smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I don't know no Melissa Hartley," he said flatly. Rachel slid a photograph across the table. Melissa at 17, all wide-eyed innocence and braces. 30 years, Clifford, Rachel said softly. "You've had 30 years to rehearse that line. But DNA doesn't lie." For a flicker of a moment, his jaw twitched. "Just barely." "We're not done here," Rachel said, standing. "Not by a long shot." Renewed hope, renewed pain. Back in Laurel Ridge, Janet Hartley sat by the window, watching late summer leaves stir in the breeze. The phone calls, the reporters, the sudden swell of public interest, it was all overwhelming. And yet, for the first time in 3 decades, she dared to imagine justice. "I just want to bring her home," Janet whispered, staring at the faded flyer on the fridge. "Even if all we find are her bones. I need to bring my baby home." The catalyst had arrived, and with it came a tidal wave of renewed pain, long-buried questions, and a fragile hope that, maybe this time, the truth wouldn't slip away. In the small evidence room at the sheriff's office, Rachel stood staring at the battered box labeled Hartley, Melissa, 1991. For 30 years, its contents had sat undisturbed, a torn hoodie, a pair of jeans, a bracelet missing one charm. Now, though, it felt different. Alive. Electric. The past wasn't done talking. And neither was she. The building hadn't changed much since 1991, same chipped brick walls, same flickering fluorescent lights above the main entrance. But inside, everything felt different. Boxes that had collected nearly 3 decades worth of dust were now stacked on a metal cart in the center of the bullpen. On top sat a worn, manila folder stamped in bold red ink. Hartley, Melissa, homicide. 1991. Detective Angela Reyes, 39, leaned against the cart, flipping through the brittle pages. The new lead from the state crime lab had arrived 2 days earlier, but even she struggled to believe it. A cold case awakened. For almost 28 years, Melissa Hartley's murder had been filed away among Wilkes County's unresolved tragedies. Investigators had chased leads, questioned friends, combed through tips, and hit dead end after dead end. But in late 2018, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, SBI, announced a statewide initiative to re-examine violent cold cases using advanced forensic testing, DNA technologies that simply hadn't existed back in 1991. Melissa's case was one of the first flagged for review. We had blood samples collected from the scene, Reyes explained later in an interview. But back then, they could only determine blood type, not an individual profile. The technology just wasn't there. Now, we can generate a full genetic fingerprint from something as small as a flake of dried skin. So in January 2019, the Wilkes County Sheriff's Office boxed up the remaining evidence: Melissa's clothing, scrapings from her fingernails, and the blood swabbed from the gravel near her car, and sent it all to the SBI's Forensic Biology Unit in Raleigh. For months, there was silence. Then came the call. The breakthrough. July 18, 2019, 11:07 a.m. Reyes remembered the exact time her office phone rang. "Detective Reyes? This is Dr. Karen Patel with the SBI lab." The voice on the other end was steady but urgent. "We've got a male DNA profile from the blood sample. Full sequence. It's strong. No degradation. It's definitely not Melissa's." Reyes leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. "Do we have a name?" "Not yet," Patel said. "But we're uploading it into CODIS right now." CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, had been a game-changer for cold cases nationwide. In 1991, it didn't exist. By 2019, it contained millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes. 2 days later, the call came back. "Angela," Patel said, "we have a match." The name that stopped them cold. The DNA belonged to Brian Matthew Cole, a 54-year-old truck mechanic from Wilkesboro. Cole had a minor rap sheet, DUI in 2007, disorderly conduct in 2012, but nothing violent. He'd lived in the area his entire life, blending seamlessly into the background. And here's the kicker. In 1991, Cole had been interviewed once by investigators but ruled out. He was a quiet neighbor, someone who claimed to have been home the night Melissa disappeared. With no physical evidence tying him to the scene, detectives moved on. Now, 28 years later, his DNA told a very different story. Rebuilding the timeline. With Cole's name in hand, Reyes and her team reconstructed his movements during the summer of 1991. June 7, 1991, 2 weeks before Melissa's death, Cole attended a friend's cookout less than a mile from the Hartley family home. Several witnesses later recalled seeing him leave early, looking drunk and angry. June 19, 1991, Melissa told a co-worker she was creeped out by a man who kept hanging around the parking lot near her workplace. At the time, she didn't know his name. June 22, 1991, Melissa disappears after leaving her late shift at Harrison's Diner. June 25, 1991, Melissa's body is discovered by hikers in a wooded area off Highway 421. Cole's house? Less than 3 miles from where she was found. This proximity, combined with the DNA, painted a chilling picture. Knocking on the past. On August 5, 2019, Reyes and her partner, Detective Eli Franklin, drove out to Cole's small, weather-beaten house on Pine Hollow Road. Franklin knocked. Cole opened the door wearing a grease-stained t-shirt and looked calm. "Mr. Cole?" Reyes said, flashing her badge. "Would like to ask you a few questions." He shrugged, stepped aside, and let them in. Inside, the air smelled of motor oil and stale cigarette smoke. Old racing posters peeled from the walls. A half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels sat on the counter. At first, Cole denied everything. "I didn't even know that girl," he said, shaking his head. Reyes slid a photo of Melissa across the table. "Your DNA was on her clothes," she said quietly. Cole stared at the image for a long moment before slumping back into his chair. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You people never let nothing go, do you?" Piecing together the confession. Cole didn't confess immediately. In fact, he lawyered up within 24 hours. But detectives already had what they needed: DNA, location data, and old witness statements that suddenly made sense in a new light. The working theory? Cole had followed Melissa from work, possibly intending to talk to her. When she rejected his advances, he snapped. The struggle turned violent, leaving traces of his blood on her clothing and near her car. Forensic genealogists, specialists who use public DNA databases to trace family trees, confirmed the profile was airtight. Melissa's family gets the call. On August 12, 2019, Reyes drove to the Hartley family's home to deliver the news personally. Melissa's mother, Deborah Hartley, opened the door. Her hair, now streaked with gray, fell softly around a lined, weary face. Reyes explained everything: the DNA, the match, the suspect. Deborah's hands trembled as she covered her mouth. Tears pooled in her eyes. "After all these years," she whispered, "we finally know." But then came the harder truth. "Mrs. Hartley," Reyes said gently, "he hasn't confessed yet. This may still go to trial." A community holds its breath. Word spread fast through Wilkes County. After 28 years of silence, Melissa's case was suddenly alive again. Front-page headlines, local news specials, whispered conversations in diners and church pews. For some, it was a relief. For others, it stirred old fears. Neighbors who'd lived alongside Cole for decades wondered how they'd missed the signs. The small town that had once been haunted by unanswered questions now had a name, but justice was still uncertain. The summer sun hung low over Raleigh, North Carolina, casting long shadows over the streets. After nearly 4 decades of uncertainty, the investigation into Melissa Hartley's 1980 disappearance and murder had finally begun to feel alive again. Detective Rachel Monroe sat at her desk, eyes locked on the DNA report spread out in front of her. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder than usual, blending with the dull thrum of voices from the hallway. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched. She picked up the report again, reading the same line for the 10th time. Partial DNA profile consistent with a first-degree relative of Harold Hal Crawford. Hal Crawford. The name wasn't new to Rachel. He'd surfaced in the original 1980 investigation, albeit briefly. A local mechanic back then, Crawford had been interviewed twice, and both times cleared due to lack of evidence. He was in his mid-20s when Melissa vanished. He'd claimed to be working a late shift the night she disappeared, an alibi corroborated by his employer, or so it seemed at the time. Now, the DNA had changed everything. The breakthrough. 2 months earlier, the cold case team had uploaded decades-old evidence from Melissa's case, a scrap of fabric from her blouse, a cigarette but found near her abandoned bicycle, into a national genealogy database. They hadn't expected much. In most cases, it was a Hail Mary. But then, the system pinged. The cigarette but had produced a familial DNA match, a close relative to someone named Aaron Crawford, a 34-year-old living in Charlotte, North Carolina. After cross-referencing family trees, detectives traced Aaron's lineage back to Hal Crawford, now 69, living quietly in a small lakeside community less than an hour from Raleigh. Rachel remembered the first time she saw Hal's photo in the DMV database. His face was weathered, lines etched deep around his mouth, his gray hair neatly combed back. On the surface, he looked like any other retiree, a man who spent his mornings fishing and afternoons watching TV. But Rachel had learned long ago that appearances meant nothing in cases like this. Surveillance begins. Within days, the team had Hal under discreet surveillance. Detective Paul Ramirez, a seasoned investigator with a calm demeanor, parked his unmarked SUV outside a bait-and-tackle shop near Hal's neighborhood. From there, he watched Hal's patterns. Mornings, drove to the lake, fished alone for hours. Afternoons, stopped at the same diner on Main Street, always ordering black coffee and a BLT. Evenings, went home. Rarely had visitors. "Guy's a creature of habit," Ramirez muttered one day, sipping his own lukewarm coffee. But there were moments that made Rachel's skin crawl. Once, Hal pulled into an empty parking lot and sat there for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. Another time, surveillance footage caught him buying a pack of cigarettes, the same brand found near Melissa's abandoned bike in 1980. Was it coincidence? Or was he taunting them without even knowing they were watching? Interviewing the past. Before making a move, Rachel decided to re-interview people from Hal's past. She found Evelyn Turner, a woman who had dated Hal briefly in 1979. Now in her 60s, Evelyn still remembered him vividly. "Hal, he had a temper," she said, her voice trembling as she stirred sugar into her tea. "Charming when he wanted to be, but if you disagreed with him, there was this look in his eyes. Like a switch flipped." When Rachel asked if Evelyn remembered the night Melissa disappeared, Evelyn hesitated. "He came over late that night," she whispered. "Said he needed to get away for a while. He didn't stay long, and he smelled like dirt. Fresh dirt." Back in 1980, Evelyn hadn't mentioned any of this to police. She'd been too scared, she admitted now. Cracking the alibi. The original investigation had relied heavily on Hal's alibi, that he was working a late shift at Rogers Auto Repair the night Melissa vanished. Rachel and Ramirez dug through old employment records, finally finding microfilm copies buried in the county archives. The logs told a different story. Hal had clocked in, but there was no record of him clocking out. Even more suspiciously, his time card had been signed by the shop's owner, Clint Rogers, a known friend of Hal's at the time. Rogers had died in 1998, taking any potential secrets with him. But the shop's foreman back then, Ray Timmons, was still alive. When Rachel tracked him down at a nursing home, his memory was hazy but intact enough to recall one detail. Hal wasn't there that night, Ray said firmly. Clint covered for him. Said Hal had something important to handle. The walls of Hal Crawford's carefully constructed alibi were crumbling. Confronting the suspect. The cold case team debated their next move. They could bring Hal in for questioning, but without hard DNA evidence linking him directly to Melissa's murder, he could lawyer up and shut them out. Instead, they decided to play the long game, gather more physical evidence. One humid August afternoon, Rachel followed Hal into the diner. She slid into a booth behind him, pretending to scroll through her phone. When Hal left, he tossed his coffee cup into the trash. Rachel retrieved it minutes later, slipping it into an evidence bag. A week later, the lab confirmed it. Hal's DNA matched the cigarette but from the crime scene. The net tightens. Rachel didn't move right away. Instead, she and Ramirez obtained a search warrant, hitting Hal's property at dawn. Inside his garage, they found an old tackle box containing a faded photograph of Melissa clipped from a 1980 newspaper. A rusted hunting knife, cleaned but still holding microscopic traces of blood. Several notebooks filled with obsessive ramblings about girls who don't listen and punishments that fit. Every item added another nail to Hal Crawford's coffin. When they confronted him, Hal's calm exterior cracked. "You think you know what happened," he sneered. "You think you understand. But Melissa, she wasn't some innocent little angel." Rachel leaned forward, holding his gaze. "Tell me, Hal. Tell me what she did." For a moment, it looked like he might confess. But then he clammed up, demanding a lawyer. The arrest. On a warm September morning, nearly 43 years after Melissa Hartley's disappearance, Hal Crawford was arrested for first-degree murder. Neighbors watched from their porches as Hal, now frail and gray, was led out in handcuffs. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others muttered that they'd always suspected something. Melissa's younger sister, Karen Hartley, stood outside the courthouse that afternoon, tears streaming down her face. "For decades, we didn't know," she said softly. "Now we do. But it doesn't bring her back." Foreshadowing the twist. Even as the department celebrated the arrest, Rachel couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Something about Hal's words gnawed at her. Melissa wasn't some innocent little angel. What did he mean by that? Was it a desperate deflection, or was there another layer to this case, one that had been buried for over 4 decades? For now, they had their suspect. But Rachel knew deep down. The story wasn't over. The air inside the Bentonville Sheriff's Office felt electric. It was mid-afternoon, but the sky outside was dark and swollen, rain streaking down the windows like tears the town had been holding back for 34 years. Detective Carla Jennings sat at her desk, knuckles white around the manila folder she'd been carrying everywhere for weeks. Inside were the lab reports, fresh DNA results from the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. When she first got the call that morning, she thought she misheard the analyst. "We've got a match," they'd said. "Melissa Hartley?" she asked, barely breathing. "Yes. It's him." Now, sitting across from her was Sheriff Bill Yates, arms folded, his weathered face unreadable. "You're absolutely certain?" he asked quietly. Jennings nodded. "The DNA from Melissa's fingernails. It's a 1 in 1.2 trillion probability. It's him, Bill. There's no mistake." Bill exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. Jesus Christ. After all these years. The name on the file had been one they all knew, Gary Lee Walters. The knock at his door. By 3:17 p.m., an unmarked Chevy pulled slowly into the cracked driveway of a modest, weather-beaten ranch house on the edge of Bentonville. The grass was patchy, the paint peeling from the porch columns, and a broken wind chime tapped a hollow rhythm in the breeze. Gary Walters, now 62 years old, stepped out onto the porch barefoot, squinting against the rain. His once thick hair was thinning and gray, and his gut pressed against a faded flannel shirt. To the casual eye, he looked harmless, just another aging small-town handyman. But Jennings wasn't fooled. "Mr. Walters," she called out evenly, stepping forward with her badge raised. "Yeah?" His voice cracked, guarded. "We need you to come with us." Confusion flickered across his face, or maybe it was practiced innocence. "What's this about?" Jennings didn't flinch. "It's about Melissa Hartley." For a split second, His eyes widened before he masked it with a dry laugh. Melissa Hartley? That was, what, 91? What's this got to do with me? The deputies moved in, cuffs ready. Gary Lee Walters, you're under arrest for the murder of Melissa Hartley. The interrogation room. The room was small, windowless, painted an institutional beige that seemed to leach the air of oxygen. A single camera blinked from the corner. Gary sat hunched over the metal table, wrists cuffed, his fingers drumming nervously. Jennings stood on the other side, silent for a long moment, letting the weight of it all hang. I didn't do nothing, Gary muttered, his voice low, but his leg bounced beneath the table. Jennings dropped the folder in front of him. Thud. She opened it slowly, deliberately. Inside were photos of Melissa, the smiling blonde senior portrait, the police crime scene photos, and finally, a blown-up page from the DNA report. Her fingernails, Gary, Jennings said softly. She fought back. She scratched you. And we finally matched it. His jaw tightened. I ain't never touched that girl. Jennings leaned forward, her voice razor-sharp. Then explain why your DNA is under her nails. Silence. Gary swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He glanced at the mirrored wall, he knew there were eyes behind it. Maybe she. I don't know. Maybe she came by my shop once. Got a cut. That could explain. Don't, Jennings snapped, slamming the file shut. We've waited 34 years for this. You owe this town the truth. You owe Melissa's family the truth. Flashback, the family's vigil. Down the hall, Melissa's mother, Janice Hartley, sat in a small waiting area, clutching a damp tissue. At 68, her hands trembled from both age and decades of grief. For so many years, she'd begged to know why. Every Christmas. Every anniversary of the day Melissa disappeared. Every time she saw a young girl in town with bright blonde hair. And now, the man who could answer her questions sat just a few rooms away. The breaking point. Back in the interrogation room, Jennings slid a small recorder across the table. This is your charts, Gary. We know what happened. You left the festival with her. People saw you. We found your fibers in the trunk. And now the DNA. Gary stared down at his hands, silent for what felt like an eternity. Then his shoulders sagged. She wasn't supposed to die, he whispered, almost to himself. Jennings' chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Go on. He rubbed his temples like the weight of decades had finally crashed onto him. She was drunk. We was at the county fair. She asked for a ride home. Jennings' jaw clenched. And then? We parked out by Miller's Creek. I just wanted to. I don't know, talk to her. But she started screaming when I tried to kiss her. Jennings' voice was ice. And you killed her. He shook his head violently. No. I didn't mean to. I just grabbed her, tried to make her stop yelling, and then. He slammed his cuffed hands on the table. Next thing I know, she's not breathing. Melissa's final moments. Jennings sat in silence, letting the confession seep into the room. Melissa's terrified struggle in that dark field. Her fingernails clawing, desperate. The quiet countryside swallowing her screams. This was the truth her family had begged for, but it felt hollow, ugly, and unbearable. Aftermath. By dusk, the rain had stopped. Bentonville Square filled with murmurs as word spread. They finally caught him. 34 years, can you believe it? Inside the sheriff's office, Janice Hartley finally saw Gary Walters being led out in cuffs. Her eyes locked on his, and for the first time, he looked small. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just whispered, almost to herself. Melissa can finally rest. Jennings watched her from a distance, her own chest heavy with the knowledge that closure was never clean. Because even when you catch the killer, the scars never heal. The Mecklenburg County Courthouse stood like a silent sentinel on a crisp October morning, its gray stone walls casting long shadows across the street. After nearly 3 decades of questions, rumors, and grief, the people of Hickory Ridge were finally promised answers. Inside, every bench in the courtroom was filled. Some faces were lined by age and time. Others had never even been alive when Melissa Hartley disappeared in 1991. For Daniel and Margaret Hartley, Melissa's parents, the day had come with a strange mix of relief and dread. Margaret clutched the same silver locket she had worn every day since Melissa vanished, its chain worn thin from years of nervous fiddling. Daniel sat rigid, jaw clenched, hands folded so tightly his knuckles blanched. Across the aisle sat Derek Shaw, now 54 but still carrying the lean build of his younger days. His once boyish charm had hardened into something else entirely, a cold, unreadable mask. He wore a Navy suit provided by his defense team, but his posture betrayed a lifetime of defiance. To some in the courtroom, he was still the friendly neighbor who fixed fences and hosted barbecues. To others, he was the monster they had feared for years. The prosecution's opening statement set the tone. District Attorney Claire Mendoza, a measured but relentless speaker, stepped to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about betrayal. It is about a community's trust shattered and a family's life stolen. For 32 years, Melissa Hartley's parents lived without knowing what happened to their daughter. And for 32 years, the man responsible sat among them, free. We intend to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Derek Shaw murdered Melissa Hartley in cold blood on the night of July 17, 1991. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Advances in DNA technology have finally allowed us to match critical evidence, found on Melissa's clothing and beneath her fingernails, directly to Mr. Shaw. The science will speak for itself. But Melissa's story deserves to be heard. And today, we will give her that voice back. The defense attorney, Graham Fields, countered with a carefully rehearsed strategy, cast doubt on the reliability of decades-old evidence. Memory fades. Evidence deteriorates. And science, while powerful, is not infallible. My client is not a murderer. He is a man who has been vilified by gossip and rumor for 30 years. We ask you to keep an open mind as we dismantle the prosecution's case. Testimonies that cut deep. The trial unfolded like a slow unspooling of grief. Witness after witness took the stand. Melissa's childhood friends, retired investigators, forensic experts. One moment silenced the room completely, when Dr. Karen Layton, the forensic biologist, explained how a microscopic scrap of preserved evidence cracked the case. In 1991, we didn't have the technology to analyze trace DNA the way we do now, she said, pointing to a projected image. But using a method called next-generation sequencing, we were able to extract a full profile from epithelial cells found under Melissa's fingernails. The profile matched Derek Shaw with a probability of 1 in 6.8 trillion. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Derek's eyes flickered for the first time, his jaw tightening. Melissa's best friend from high school, Kelly Pearson, also testified, her voice trembling. Melissa told me that night she was going to meet Derek, she whispered, tears spilling over. She thought he had something important to tell her about a job at his auto shop. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. For Daniel and Margaret, every testimony was a blade reopening old wounds. Margaret leaned into Daniel's shoulder, eyes squeezed shut, while he stared straight ahead, his expression carved from stone. The moment of reckoning. The prosecution's case was strong, but the turning point came during the cross-examination of Derek Shaw himself. Against his lawyer's advice, Derek chose to testify, a decision rooted in arrogance. Mendoza approached slowly, her voice calm but edged with steel. Mendoza, Mr. Shaw, you've maintained for 30 years that you had nothing to do with Melissa's disappearance. Is that correct? Shaw, that's right. Mendoza, then why did your DNA taken from your saliva when you were arrested, match the DNA found under Melissa Hartley's fingernails? Shaw, pauses, shifts in his seat, I don't know how it got there. Mendoza, you don't know? Shaw, I worked on her car once, months before. Maybe it was from that. Mendoza, so you're suggesting her fingernails preserved your DNA from a casual interaction months earlier? The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens. Mendoza leaned forward. Mendoza, Mr. Shaw, Melissa fought for her life. The evidence shows she clawed her attacker's face, drawing blood. Did you have scratches the next day? Shaw, I don't remember. Mendoza, the photos from July 18, 1991, show 3 deep scratches on your right cheek. Would you like the jury to see them? Derek's composure cracked. For the first time, his mask slipped, revealing a flicker of panic. Verdict and sentencing. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 5 hours. When they returned, the tension was suffocating. We, the jury, find the defendant, Derek Shaw, guilty of first-degree murder. Margaret collapsed into Daniel's arms, sobs shaking her small frame. Across the aisle, Derek stared blankly, his lips pressed into a thin line. He showed no remorse. At sentencing, Mendoza's voice was unwavering. For 32 years, Melissa's family has lived in a prison of uncertainty. Today, we close the door on that chapter. The judge sentenced Derek Shaw to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aftermath and healing. The verdict brought closure, but not peace. In the weeks that followed, Hickory Ridge began confronting the shadows it had carried for decades. Margaret started attending a local grief support group, finally allowing herself to speak Melissa's name without choking on it. Daniel, who had thrown himself into work for years, began spending time with his grandchildren, determined to honor his daughter's memory by living fully. The community erected a memorial bench near the old riverbank where Melissa's body was found, a quiet place for reflection. Her name, carved into polished oak, became a reminder that she was more than a victim. For some, though, wounds remained raw. Rumors swirled that Derek Shaw might have been involved in other unsolved disappearances from the early 90s. Old fears stirred, and investigators quietly reopened files long thought forgotten. But for Melissa's family, the relentless search was finally over. In a small interview after the sentencing, Margaret held her silver locket tightly and whispered, "I can finally take her flowers without wondering if he's walking free. That's enough for me." The camera panned across the courthouse steps, capturing a moment 3 decades in the making: justice, bittersweet and overdue. The courthouse steps were quiet now. Months had passed since Jonathan Price was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the abduction and murder of Melissa Hartley. The trial had been brutal: raw testimony, reconstructed timelines, and DNA evidence so damning that there was little left to dispute. The community of Maple Hollow had waited 31 long years for justice, and yet, when the gavel fell, the relief wasn't as complete as anyone had imagined. For many, this was closure. For others, it was simply the end of one chapter in a story that had defined their lives. The weight of lost years. In the weeks following the trial, local reporters revisited the case, producing long-form retrospectives about Melissa's life, her disappearance, and the 3 decades of uncertainty her family endured. Caroline Hartley, Melissa's mother, now 73, agreed to a rare interview. "I used to think finding out what happened would make the pain go away," she said, her voice fragile yet steady. "But it doesn't. Justice is important, we needed it, but it doesn't give me my daughter back. All it does is put a name and a face to the monster in the dark." Caroline had spent years living 2 parallel lives, one where she tried to move forward, attending birthdays and weddings for Melissa's siblings, and another where she was trapped in 1991, replaying the night Melissa vanished over and over. Melissa's younger brother, Aaron, reflected on the ripple effects. "I was 14 when she disappeared. Our family fell apart after that. Mom blamed Dad for letting her walk home alone. Dad blamed himself for years. I left town as soon as I could because every corner, every tree, every face, it all reminded me of her." He paused before adding, quietly, "This conviction gave us answers. But it didn't give us back the family we used to be." A town forever marked. Maple Hollow, once known as a quiet Pennsylvania town, will forever be linked to Melissa Hartley's murder. In the 1990s, parents used Melissa's disappearance as a warning. Don't walk home alone after dark. Remember Melissa. As years turned into decades, that warning evolved into something more haunting, a local legend. Her case spawned countless theories, whispers of cover-ups, and false sightings that dragged the Hartleys through cycles of hope and heartbreak. But with the trial over, a new narrative began to take hold. Modern forensics had finally brought justice where human memory and eyewitness accounts had failed. Detective Laura Kinney, now retired but who had been one of the lead investigators during the reopening of the case, described it as a turning point. "Back in 91, we had nothing. No cameras, no cell phones, no social media to track movements. All we had were tire tracks and some vague witness statements. If it weren't for advancements in DNA profiling, we'd still be guessing." She gestured to the courthouse steps, where candles and flowers had been laid out during the trial. "This is why we never give up on cold cases. The science changes. The tools evolve. What we can't see today, we might uncover tomorrow." Lessons from the Melissa Hartley case. The Melissa Hartley case reshaped the way Pennsylvania law enforcement approached missing persons investigations and cold cases. 1. Preservation of evidence. In 1991, most of the evidence collected at the crime scene sat in poorly labeled boxes for years, nearly lost to time. Had a single evidence bag gone missing, Jonathan Price might still be free. After the trial, the state introduced stricter protocols to ensure evidence in unsolved cases is preserved indefinitely. 2. The power of forensic genealogy. It was a tiny skin cell fragment from Melissa's clothing that cracked the case open. In 2022, it was uploaded to a genetic genealogy database, eventually linking Price through a distant relative's DNA. Without this technology, there would have been no arrest, no trial, no justice. 3. The human toll. While science solved the mystery, it couldn't mend broken families. The Hartleys had endured 3 decades of suspicion, rumors, and dead ends. Therapists and victim advocates say the Melissa Hartley case became a case study in ambiguous loss, a type of grief that comes from not knowing. Reflections from the community. After the sentencing, Maple Hollow organized a memorial service for Melissa. Hundreds gathered under the willow tree in Oak Ridge Park, where her friends once used to meet after school. Pastor Elliot Bryant, who officiated the service, said, "For 31 years, we carried Melissa's story like a wound. Now we carry it as a reminder, not just of what we lost, but of what we owe each other. Every child in this town deserves to walk home safely. Every family deserves answers." Among the crowd were residents who had grown up with the Hartleys, former classmates, and young parents holding their own children tight. It was a moment where grief, relief, and resilience coexisted. Jonathan Price's silence. Even after his conviction, Jonathan Price never confessed in his own words. No apology. No explanation. During his final statement before sentencing, he stared blankly ahead, refusing to acknowledge Melissa's family seated in the front row. His defense team claimed he had nothing to gain by speaking. For Caroline Hartley, that silence stung more than the verdict soothed. He took her from us. He haunted us for 31 years. And still, he won't even give us the dignity of knowing why. Price's refusal left an open wound, one that no amount of evidence could close. The bigger picture. Melissa's case is not unique. Across the U.S., there are over 250,000 unsolved murders and missing persons cases, many languishing in evidence rooms, waiting for technology to catch up. Experts say the Melissa Hartley investigation highlights 3 key realities. Cold cases don't die. They evolve as science advances. Families deserve transparency. Years of misinformation and dead ends deepen trauma. Community memory matters. Without Melissa's friends and neighbors pushing for renewed attention, her case might never have been reopened. A mother's final words. At the closing of Melissa's memorial, Caroline Hartley addressed the crowd, her voice trembling but resolute. Melissa was more than a case file. She was my daughter. She loved to paint. She sang in the church choir. She had this laugh that could fill a room. For 31 years, she was frozen in time for us, forever 19. But today, I choose to let her live again, not through her death, but through her life. The crowd stood in silence, many holding candles, as the sun dipped below the trees. For the first time in decades, Maple Hollow felt still, as though the weight of uncertainty had finally lifted, even if the ache of loss would never fade. Epilogue, justice, but not peace. As the years pass, Melissa's name will remain etched into Maple Hollow's history. Her case will be taught in law enforcement seminars, cited in studies about forensic genealogy, and whispered about by generations who never even met her. For her family, however, the story is both finished and unfinished. Justice has been served, but the emptiness of absence remains. Detective McKinney summed it up best. Solving a cold case doesn't erase the pain. It just changes its shape. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson the Melissa Hartley case leaves behind. Justice can deliver answers, but never restoration.